I'm Margaret Langford, 69 years old, and tonight I learned what my family thinks a widow is worth. The dining room was warm with honey-colored light that made silverware gleam, and truths look softer than they are. Vanessa's bracelets chimed when she lifted her wine glass, a sharp sound that pricked like a pin. We were halfway through the roast when talk slid from condolences to simplifying the estate. I felt the table tilt under my ribs. I asked about our attorney, about the trust George and I set up when the boys still shared a bedroom. Vanessa didn't look up. She stared at the knife in her hand and said almost sweetly, "You're just the widow Margaret. It's better if you sit quiet." A chuckle, quick and thoughtless, rolled around the table. Daniel's sounded like the one he made as a teenager when he thought he'd gotten away with something small, $20 from his father's wallet, a broken vase blamed on the dog. The laugh settled like dust on the rim of my water glass. I set my fork down. No speech, no bark of chair legs, just the soft push of linen against my palms as I stood. I left the apple pie on the counter, the one George said tasted like October. I walked through the doorway and felt eyes on the back of my coat. No one called my name. Outside, the air was cold enough to make my teeth ache when I breathed. In the car, I watched their windows glow, and a thought settled heavier than anger, steadier than grief. I have been quiet for the building. I will not be quiet for the taking. By the time the porch light blinked off behind me, a plan had opened, like a hinge inside my chest. When the sun came up, whatever they believed they controlled would be nothing but yesterday's certainty. The house knew me better than anyone. It sighed when I opened the door, and lemon oil and paper warmed the hall. I set my purse on the entry table George built the winter we couldn't afford gifts, then turned off my phone. In the living room, the blanket we always fought over his cold feet, my patience lay folded across his recliner. I sat not because I was tired, but because the weight of that dinner needed somewhere to land. Just the widow, I said, into a room that loved me back. The words didn't echo. They dissolved. At 2:11 a.m. I stood. It was late. Grief makes circles. Resolve makes lines. I went to George's study, switched on the desk lamp, and pulled out the bottom file drawer, the one that sticks the one only he and I ever wrestled. There was the usual life tax returns warranties. Behind the folders sat a white envelope, thick and quiet, my name in George's slanted block letters. I broke the seal with my thumbnail. 1 page first, blue-lined paper. If you're reading this, Maggie, I'm not there to argue about taking care of yourself. The boys are good at wanting. Vanessa is good at getting. I changed some things. Don't fix it. Use it. The documents beneath were all teeth and spine notarized amendments, dissolution of the trust board transfer of authority, effective upon my signature and his absence. 8 months ago. I pressed my thumb to the date stamp like I could feel its temperature. He had done the thing I never asked for because he knew I'd never ask. The street beyond the curtains was a deeper dark. I stacked the papers, opened my address book, and at 3:47 a.m., dialed Robert Keller's home number. Robert! I said, steady as a plumb line, I'm invoking everything George set in motion. We start at 9. Outside, the first wind of morning tapped the window as if to say, hurry. Robert arrived at 8:58 this morning, early punctual with the kind of punctuality that feels like respect. He stood on my porch with his coat unbuttoned and a scuffed leather briefcase. When I opened the door, he didn't offer condolences. He looked at my face, then at the neat stack on the dining table, and nodded. We spread the papers on the dining table. We read in silence. His finger traced dates, stamps, signatures. George prepared this well, he said at last. He dissolved the board. Authority passes entirely to you upon filing these acknowledgments and issuing new instructions. And he anticipated challenges. Good man. I poured 2 coffees. The sip steadied me. We file today, I said. No advance calls, no warnings. Robert's mouth tugged, not quite a smile. Quiet execution, he said. Understood. By 10:15, we were on speaker with the estate manager, who shifted from bland politeness to crisp deference once Robert cited the amendments. The brokerage portal updated while we watched. Titles queued for recording. Email confirmations pinged my laptop. The account names changed in tidy lines that felt like doors locking. At noon, I signed 3 acknowledgments and initialed a dozen margins, the ink drying like small shadows. Robert placed copies in his briefcase and left originals in my fireproof box, sliding it home with a clunk. "Do you want to tell them now or let the systems do it?" he asked, standing. I glanced at the clock. "Let the systems speak," I said. "They listen better to screens than to me." Robert paused at the threshold. "There may be noise." "There will be," I answered. I just changed who holds the volume. After he left, the house felt taller to me. My phone buzzed on the entry table, texts, then calls rolling into voicemail. I let them pile like snow on a windshield. At 5:05, I picked up the folder, put on my coat, and headed for Daniel's front door. The stone path to Daniel's porch felt shorter than it had 2 nights ago. Maybe it was the folder in my hand or the way I'd stopped carrying the weight of asking for a place. The wind smelled of a chimney fire. I knocked once. The door opened halfway. Daniel stood there in a sweater he hadn't owned when George was alive. His smile was the one he used with bank managers practiced a little tight. "Mom, we were just—" he started. I stepped past him. Vanessa was in the kitchen, her phone face down, arms crossed. Ethan lingered near the hallway, one shoulder against the wall, eyes moving between us. I set the folder on the counter, opened it slowly. "This is the current estate plan," I said. "Everything is in my name. All accounts, all properties, all decision-making authority." Silence spread. Daniel's brow furrowed as he reached for a page. "You can't just—" he began, then stopped when he saw the notarized seals, the dates, the signature he knew as well as his own. Vanessa leaned closer, scanning for loopholes. "This isn't binding," she said too quickly. I handed her the final document, Robert's counter-signature beside George's, the dissolution clause in bold. Her eyes paused on the stamp, then stopped. "This isn't a discussion," I said, stacking the papers. "It's a notification. As of this morning, you have no legal claim to any of it." No one moved. No one looked for backup. For once, the room stayed quiet with me in it. I closed the folder, tucked it under my arm, and walked toward the door. At the threshold, I turned back. "The next time you want to talk about my future, you'll need an appointment." I left them standing in the house George and I paid for choking on the control they thought they held. That night, the phone lit up the dark like a faulty street lamp, buzzing still. I didn't answer. Silence wasn't a void. It was insulation. By morning, the unanswered calls had become a stack of missed numbers. I made oatmeal stirred in brown sugar and ate it by the kitchen window as if the world outside were steady. Around 10, Robert's number flashed. His voice had a current under it. "We found something," he said. Half an hour later, I was sitting in his office, the air smelling of legal pads. He slid a folder toward me. Inside were bank statements, loan agreements, and transfer slips. Every line had Daniel's name where it didn't belong. Robert spoke evenly. $500,000 in loans using George's business line of credit as collateral, taken while George was in treatment. I traced a date with my fingertip. 2 weeks after the first surgery. The hospital intake forms had barely dried. He did this knowing what George was going through, I said. Robert nodded once. "We can press charges," he said, "or let the financial pressure do the work. Your call." I closed the folder, its weight bending my wrist. Not yet. I want him broke before he's scared. That afternoon, I made calls to the property manager about the cabin, to the title office, about the downtown condo Ethan had been quietly renting to the dealership, about the SUV Vanessa paraded to her friends. Each voice on the other end confirmed the same thing: my signature was the only one that mattered. By evening, my list felt less like notes and more like a map. Daniel had planted a field of bad decisions. I was about to turn off the water. Outside, the street was ordinary. Inside, the current was changing direction. They didn't know the tide had started to go out. 2 days later, the first ripple hit. Daniel's text came in mid-morning. "Hey, weird question, why's the cabin account locked?" I didn't reply. 15 minutes later, Vanessa called. I let it ring until her voice turned syrupy on voicemail. By 4:30, the family group chat buzzed like a hornet nest. Ethan finally broke his usual silence with, "Did someone change access on Mom's end?" I set the phone face down and poured myself tea. I didn't intend to drink. At 5:05, I walked the stone path to their front porch again, the folder under my arm like a case file. Daniel opened the door, irritation masked with a brittle smile. Vanessa stood at the kitchen island, arms folded. Ethan hovered in the hallway. Half in shadow, I laid documents on the counter, sale agreements, transfer notices, account freezes. "These are the first changes," I said. "The cabin will be listed by Friday. The condo lease is terminated. The SUV goes back to the dealer next week." Daniel's jaw worked like he was chewing words. "You're going to burn the whole family down over some paperwork," I met his eyes. "No. You did that when you took from your father's business while he was fighting to stay alive." Vanessa's nails clicked before she found her voice. "This is ridiculous. George would never—" He knew I cut in. He knew enough to make sure you couldn't touch a dime after he was gone. Ethan shifted his eyes, darting between us, measuring the space like there might be an exit in the air. I gathered the papers into the folder and headed for the door. At the threshold, I glanced over my shoulder. "This is the polite phase," I said. "It doesn't have to last." Outside, the wind felt sharper, or maybe that was clarity, the taking was over. The next morning, I called the estate's real estate attorney, a steady man named Harris, who still sent Christmas cards. By noon, we were sitting across from each other in his downtown office, traffic hum, mixing with the shuffle of property deeds. We started with the lake cabin, 2-bedroom cedar siding, the place George and I painted when money was tight. Harris marked it for immediate listing. Next was the downtown condo Ethan had been renting for under-the-table cash. The lease termination papers slid into the file stack without hesitation. Last came Vanessa's gleaming SUV still on a lease George had signed. "Repossession will be straightforward," Harris said, tucking the form away. By the end of the meeting, the path was set within a week. Each asset would be either sold or reclaimed, the proceeds routed into accounts they couldn't see. Back home, I poured coffee into a chipped mug and watched the neighborhood. Somewhere across town, Daniel would try to log into accounts that no longer recognized him. Vanessa would plan a grocery run her card would decline before the bread aisle. After 3, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. It was Vanessa. Her voice pitched high. "You can't just strip us of everything we have rights, then sharper you're doing this out of spite." I didn't save the message. Spite was small. This was scale. That evening, Olivia sent a text. "Dad is freaking out. They're talking about moving in with Aunt Linda." "Is this permanent?" I stared at the screen before replying, "Actions are permanent. So are consequences." She didn't answer, but typing dots came and went. I set the phone aside, the quiet settling over the house. Outside, streetlights blinked on. Inside, I could feel ground under them shift, and I wouldn't warn them where the cracks were. Vanessa's next move came sooner than I expected. 3 days after the condo lease termination notice went out, a plain envelope slid under my door. No return address, just my name in shaky letters. Inside was a photocopy of a capacity evaluation recommended form, unsigned but highlighted in red like a threat. I'd seen this before. Years with George taught me how people try to paint decision makers as unfit. Vanessa wasn't creative. She was desperate. I drove to Robert's office and dropped the form on his desk. "Trace it," I said. "Find out who ordered it, who touched it, and how it got here." 2 days later, Robert called with clipped satisfaction. It was Vanessa. She approached a notary she knew and tried to backdate it. "We've got emails, and the assistant has already given a statement." "Press charges," I said without pause. That evening, as the sun slipped behind the maples on Daniels Street, a county sheriff's cruiser rolled to a stop in their driveway. Neighbors leaned on fences, phones angled low. Vanessa came out in designer heels and indignation voice breaking. Daniel moved to step between her and the deputies, but one firm hand to his chest stopped him. I wasn't there, but Olivia called me later, voice hushed, like the walls might listen. "She tried to say it was your fault," she whispered, but nobody believed her. not even Dad. I told her some people don't break. They rot from the inside until there's nothing left but noise. There was a pause on the line, her breathing slow and steady. For the first time in weeks, I thought she could see the truth without me spelling it out. In the quiet after we hung up, I poured wine and sat on the porch. The air smelled like rain. Somewhere, the snap of a closing door echoed that night. Vanessa's arrest rippled through their lives like a crack in ice, silent then widening. Within a week, she took a plea deal, no jail time but a record, and a fine big enough to rattle their last screws of stability. Daniel didn't call to defend her, and for once, he didn't call to blame me. His silence was louder than any argument. I turned to what came next. There were taxes to file, properties to close, and decisions about the future of what George and I had built. I wouldn't clutch every asset like a dragon. I wanted them protected, not mummified. One morning, I called Olivia and asked her to come by after school. She arrived with a low-slung backpack and the same lopsided ponytail she'd worn since 8. I slid a single sheet across the table. She read it twice, her eyes widening. It's the deed I said. The little house with the yellow shutters outside town. It's yours now. Her voice cracked. I don't deserve this. You do, I told her, because you didn't pretend. She folded the paper carefully. That week, I also met with a nonprofit consultant about starting the George Langford Second Chance Fund, small grants for widowed women over 60 pushed out of financial decisions. The first application came before the website launched a handwritten letter from a woman in Ohio, whose children emptied her account the day after the funeral. I approved it quickly. By Friday, I'd closed the last joint account tied to Daniel's fraudulent loans and donated the remaining business inventory to a local incubator. The phone rang less. The quiet was mine, not the silence they shoved me into, but the kind I built. And in that quiet, I began to see the shape of what was still mine and what I was willing to give away. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, slipped into my mailbox between a bill and a grocery flyer. Daniel's handwriting hadn't changed since high school, tight leaning forward. Family gathering. Time to reconnect and reset. No mention of where we'd left off. No apology, just vague language people use to erase being wrong. I didn't go to forgive. I went because sometimes the people who erased you need to see you standing at full height. The house looked the same from the street, but the yard was unkempt, the porch light flickered. Olivia opened the door and hugged me longer than politeness required. Inside, the air was heavy with overcooked beef and unsaid things. Ethan lingered in the background. Daniel stood at the head of the table like it was still his. He started speaking before I sat down. Families go through storms, he said, voice steady, eyes flicking aside. We weather them differently. This isn't a storm, I said, setting my glass down. It's the consequence. And every one of you wrote it. The room stilled. Daniel opened his mouth maybe to defend himself, but I raised a hand. You told me I was just the widow, that I should sit quietly. But I wasn't quiet when I built this family, and I won't be quiet now that I've taken it back. Olivia held my gaze. Ethan shifted his chair, scraping the floor. I stood for a long moment. This table, this room, they're mine, legally, emotionally, structurally. You're guests here. Remember that. No one followed me to the door. Outside, the air was sharp and clean. I walked to my car without looking back. I didn't feel victorious. I felt settled. I had walked through the fire and was already rebuilding, not because they allowed it, because I allowed it. The weeks that followed moved at a deliberate pace. I kept busy, not with frantic patching, but with steady work of building something new. The yellow shutters on the little house outside town got a fresh coat of paint under Olivia's direction, her laughter mixing with the brush on wood. One morning over coffee on my porch, I opened the photo album George used to leaf through on Sundays. There they were, Daniel and Ethan at 5 and 7, grinning with scraped knees, holding cones too big. I studied those faces not from nostalgia, but to remember I had loved them once, before they mistook patience for permission. Robert called that afternoon to confirm the last fraudulent accounts tied to Daniel had closed cease and desist letters sent. "You're at 100% control," he said. I thanked him and hung up the weight in my chest, lighter, but not gone. That night, Olivia stopped by, unannounced, holding a pie she'd baked. Apple, she said. Granddad's favorite. We ate it warm in the kitchen, the scent of cinnamon and sugar in the air. She told me about her college plans, about maybe using the little house as her first place. Her voice was hopeful again. When she left, I stood in the doorway, the cool night air on my face. I thought about the night I walked away from Daniel's table, how cold the air felt, then how heavy my steps. Now the air felt the same, but my steps were lighter. They had called me just the widow, but in the end, I was the one who wrote the last line of this story on my terms in my voice with steady hands. And that more than any title or inheritance was the win I never thought I'd get, but had earned